Two regimes of the image can be contrasted point by point: an organic regime and a crystalline regime, or more generally, a kinetic regime and a chronic regime. The first point concerns descriptions. A description which assumes the independence of its object will be called organic. It is not a matter of knowing if the object is really independent. It is not a matter of knowing if these are exteriors or scenery. What counts is that, whether they are scenery or exteriors. The setting described is presented as independent of the description which the camera gives of it, and stands for a supposedly pre-existing reality. In contrast, what we will call a crystalline description stands for its object, replaces it, both creates and erases it, and constantly gives way to other descriptions which contradict, displace, or modify the preceding ones. Organic descriptions which presuppose the independence of a setting serve to define sensory-motor situations, while crystalline descriptions which constitute their own object refer to purely optical and sound situations detached from their motor extension. This is a cinema of the seer and no longer of the agent. The organic system will consist of two modes of existence as two poles in opposition to each other, linkages of actuals from the point of view of the real, and actualizations in consciousness from the point of view of the imaginary. The crystalline regime is completely different. The actual is cut off from its motor linkages, or the real from its legal connections, and the virtual, for its part, detaches itself from its actualizations, starts to be valid for itself. The two modes of existence are now combined in a circuit, where the real and the imaginary, the actual and the virtual, chase after each other, exchange their roles, and become indiscernible. It is here that we may speak the most precisely of crystal image, the coalescence of an actual image and its virtual image, the indiscernibility of the two distinct images. Organic narration consists of the development of sensory-motor schemata, as a result of which the characters react to situations, or act in such a way as to disclose the situation. This is a truthful narration in the sense that it claims to be true, even in fiction. Such a regime is complex because it can produce interventions from breaks, ellipses, insertions of recollections, and dreams, and above all because it implies a certain usage of speech as a development factor. However, we are not yet considering the specific nature of this factor. We simply note that the sensory-motor schema is concretely located in a hodological space, which is defined by a field of forces, oppositions and tensions between these forces, resolutions of these tensions according to the distribution of goals, obstacles, means, detours. We can say in general that time is the object of an indirect representation, insofar as it is a consequence of action, is dependent on movement, and is inferred from space. Hence, no matter how disordered it is, it remains in principle a chronological time. Crystalline narration is quite different, since it implies a collapse of sensory-motor schemata. Sensory-motor situations have given way to pure optical and sound situations to which characters who have become seers cannot or will not react. So great is their need to see properly what there is in the situation. There are empty and amorphous spaces which lose their Euclidean coordinates in the style of Ozu or Antonini. There are crystallized spaces when the landscapes become hallucinatory in a setting which now retains only crystalline seeds and crystallizable materials. Now, what characterizes these spaces is that their nature cannot be explained in a simply spatial way. They imply non-localizable relations. These are direct presentations of time. We no longer have an indirect image of time which derives from movement, but a direct time image from which movement derives. We no longer have a chronological time which can be overturned by movements which are contingently abnormal. We have a chronic, non-chronological time which produces movements necessarily abnormal, essentially false. If time appears directly, it is in deactualized peaks of present. It is in virtual sheets of past. The indirect image of time is constructed in the organic regime in accordance with sensory-motor situations, but the two direct time images appear in the crystalline system in consequence of pure optical and sound situations. Leibniz says that the naval battle may or may not take place, but that this is not in the same world. It takes place in one world and does not take place in a different world. And these two worlds are possible but are not compossible with each other. He is thus obliged to forge the wonderful notion of incompossibility, very different from contradiction, in order to resolve the paradox while saving truth. According to him, it is not the impossible, but only the incompossible that proceeds from the possible, and the past may be true without being necessarily true. But the crisis of truth thus enjoys a pause rather than a solution, for nothing prevents us from affirming that incompossibles belong to the same world, that incompossible worlds belong to the same universe. This is Borges's reply to Leibniz. The straight line as a force of time, as labyrinth of time, is also the line which forks and keeps on forking, passing through incompossible presents, returning to not necessarily true pasts. A new status of narration follows from this. Narration ceases to be truthful, that is, to claim to be true, and becomes fundamentally falsifying. This is not at all a case of each has its own truth, a variability of content. It is a power of the false, which replaces and supersedes the form of the true, because it poses the simultaneity of incompossible presence, or the coexistence of not necessarily true pasts. Crystalline description was already reaching the indiscernibility of the real and the imaginary, but the falsifying narration, which corresponds to it, goes a step further and poses inexplicable differences to the present and alternatives which are undecidable between true and false. To the past, the truthful man dies, every model of truth collapses in favor of the new narration. We have not mentioned the author, who is essential in this regard. It is Nietzsche, who, under the name of will to power, substitutes the power of the false for the form of the true, and resolves the crisis of truth, wanting to settle it once and for all, but in opposition to Leibniz, in favor of the false and its artistic, creative power. Narration is no longer a truthful narration which is linked to real sensory-motor descriptions. Description becomes its own object and narration becomes temporal and falsifying at exactly the same time. The formation of the crystal, the force of time, and the power of the false are strictly complementary and constantly imply each other as the new coordinates of the image. There is no value judgment here because this new regime, no less than the old one, throws up its ready-made formulas, its set procedures, its labored and empty applications, its failures, its conventional and second-hand examples, offered to us as masterpieces. What is interesting is the new status of the image, this new type of narration description, insofar as it initially inspires very different great authors. All this can be summed up by saying that the forger becomes the character of the cinema. not the criminal, the cowboy, the psychosocial man, the historical hero, the holder of power, etc. The forger could previously exist in a determinate form, liar or traitor, but he now assumes an unlimited figure which permeates the whole film. He is simultaneously the man of pure descriptions and the maker of the crystal image, the indiscernibility of the real and the imaginary. He passes into the crystal and makes the direct time image visible. He provokes undecidable alternatives and inexplicable differences between the true and the false, and thereby imposes a power of the false as adequate to time, in contrast to any form of the true, which would control time. Truthful narration is developed organically according to legal connections in space and chronological relations in time. Of course, the elsewhere may be close to the here, and the former to the present. But this variability of places and moments does not call the relations and connections into question. But whether explicitly or not, narration always refers to a system of judgment, even when acquittal takes place due to the benefit of the doubt, or when the guilty is so only because of fate. Falsifying narration, by contrast, frees itself from this system. It shatters the system of judgment, because the power of the false, not error or doubt, affects the investigator and the witness as much as the person presumed guilty. The power of the false cannot be separated from an irreducible multiplicity. I is another. Je ai un autre has replaced ego equals ego. The power of the false exists only from the perspective of a series of powers, always referring to each other and passing into one another, so that investigators, witnesses, and innocent or guilty heroes will participate in the same power of the false, the degrees of which they will embody at each stage of the narration. Even the truthful man ends up realizing that he has never stopped lying, as Nietzsche said. The forger will thus be inseparable from a chain of forgers, into whom he metamorphoses. Everywhere it is the metamorphoses of the false which replace the form of the true. This is the essential point, how the new regime of the image, the direct time image, works with the pure crystalline optical and sound descriptions, and falsifying purely chronic narrations. Description stops presupposing a reality, and narration stops referring to a form of the true, at one and the same time. Is this to say that in life everything is a matter of forces? Yes, if it is understood that the relation of forces is not quantitative, but necessarily implies certain qualities. There are forces which are now able to respond to others only in a single, uniform, and invariable way. The scorpion in Mr. Arcadin knows only how to sting, and stings the frog that carries him across the water, even if it means death by drowning. Variability thus survives in the relation of forces, since the scorpion's sting turns against itself when it is directed in this case at the frog. Nonetheless, the scorpion is the type of a force which no longer knows how to metamorphose itself, according to the variations of what it can affect and what it can be affected by. This is a type of exhausted force, even when it has remained quantitatively very large, and it can only destroy and kill before destroying itself, and perhaps in order to kill itself. It is here that it rediscovers a center, but one which coincides with death. No matter how large it is exhausted because it no longer knows how to transform itself. It is thus descending, decadent, and degenerate. It represents impotence in bodies, that is, that precise point where the will to power is nothing but a will to dominate, a being for death, which thirsts for its own death as long as it can pass through that of others. It is what Nietzsche called the stages of nihilism, the spirit of revenge in various shapes. Behind the truthful man who judges life from the perspective of supposedly higher values, there is the sick man, the man sick with himself, who judges life from the perspective of his sickness, his degeneration, and his exhaustion. And this is perhaps better than the truthful man, because a life of sickness is still life. It contrasts life with death, rather than contrasting it with higher values. Nietzsche said, behind the truthful man who judges life, there is the sick man, sick with life itself. And Wells adds, behind the frog, the epitome of the truthful animal, there is the scorpion, the animal sick with itself. The first is an idiot, and the second is a bastard. They are, however, complementary as two figures of nihilism, two figures of the will to power. Does this not amount to restoring a system of judgment? But it is not a matter of judging life in the name of a higher authority, which would be the good, the true. It is a matter, on the contrary, of evaluating every being, every action and passion, even every value, in relation to the life which they involve. Affect as immanent evaluation instead of judgment as transcendent value. I love or I hate instead of I judge. Nietzsche, who had already substituted affect for judgment, warned his readers, beyond good and evil does not in the least mean beyond the good and the bad. This bad is exhausted and degenerating life, all the more terrible and apt to multiply itself. But the good is outpouring, ascending life, the kind which knows how to transform itself and metamorphose itself according to the forces it encounters, and which forms a constantly larger force with them, always increasing the power to live, always opening new possibilities. Of course, there is no more truth in one life than in the other. There is only becoming, and becoming is the power of the false of life, the will to power. But there is good and bad that is noble and base. According to physicists, noble energy is the kind which is capable of transforming itself, while the base kind can no longer do so. There is will to power on both sides, but the latter is nothing more than will to dominate in the exhausted becoming of life, while the former is artistic will, or virtue, which gives the creation of new possibilities in the outpouring becoming. The so-called higher men are base or bad, but the good has only one name. It is generosity. If becoming is the power of the false, and the good, the generous, the noble, is what raises the false to the nth power, or the will to power, to the level of artistic becoming. And it is clear that becoming is always innocent, even in crime, even in the exhausted life, insofar as it is still a becoming, but only the good allows itself to be exhausted by life rather than exhausting it, always putting itself at the service of what is reborn from life, what metamorphoses and creates. Out of becoming it makes a being, so protean, instead of dispatching it into non-being from the height of a uniform and fixed being. There are two states of life which are in opposition at the heart of immanent becoming, and not one instance which would claim to be superior to becoming, whether in order to judge life or to appropriate it, and in any event to exhaust it. Nevertheless, in becoming, the earth has lost all center, not only in itself, but in that it no longer has a center around which to turn. Bodies no longer have centers except of their death, when they are exhausted and return to the earth to dissolve there. Force no longer has a center precisely because it is inseparable from its relation to other forces. So short shots constantly topple to right and left, and the sequence shot likewise throws up a jumble of vanishing centers. There is in Wells a mutation, which is as much cinematographic as metaphysical, for what contrasts with the ideal of truth is not movement. Movement remains perfectly consistent with the true, while it presents invariants, points of gravity of the moving body, privileged points, through which it passes, and point of fixity in relation to which it moves. This is why the movement image in its very essence is answerable to the effect of truth which it invokes, while movement preserves its centers. And this is what we have been trying to say from the beginning of this study. A cinematographic mutation occurs when aberrations of movement take on their independence. That is, when the moving bodies and movements lose their invariance. There then occurs a reversal, where movement ceases to demand the true, and where time ceases to be subordinate to movement both at once. Movement which is fundamentally decentered becomes false movement, and time which is fundamentally liberated becomes power of the false, which is now brought into effect in false movement. By raising the false to power, life freed itself of appearances as well as truth, neither true nor false, an undecidable alternative, but power of the false, decisive will, a becoming, an irreducible multiplicity. Characters or forms are now valid only as transformations of each other. Nevertheless, everything is not equivalent to everything else, and all the forgers are not all to the same degree, or with the same power. The truthful man forms part of them, like the frog, for he invokes a true world, but the true world itself implies the truthful man. In itself it is an inaccessible and useless world. Like the cathedral, its only quality is to have been made by men. Thus it is not hidden by appearances. It is it, on the contrary, which hides appearances and provides them with an alibi. Behind the truthful man there is the forger, the scorpion, and the one constantly refers back to the other. The expert in truth gives approval, precisely because the forger has created them by reference to the expert's own criteria. In short, the forger cannot be reduced to a simple copier, nor to a liar, because what is false is not simply a copy, but already the model. Should we not say, then, that the artist, even Vermeer, even Picasso, is a forger, since he makes a model with appearances, even if the next artist gives the model back to appearances in order to make a new model? From the truthful man to the artist, the chain of forgers is long. This is obviously why it is so difficult to define the forger, because we do not take into account his multiplicity, his ubiquity, and because we are content to refer to a historical and ultimately chronological time. But everything is changed in the perspective of time as becoming. What we can criticize in the forgers as well as in the truthful man is their exaggerated taste for form. They have neither the sense nor the power of metamorphosis. They reveal an impoverishment of the vital force, élan vital, of an already exhausted life. The difference between the forger, the expert, and Vermeer is that the first two barely know how to change. Only the creative artist takes the power of the false to a degree which is realized not in form, but in transformation. There is no longer either truth or appearance. There is no longer either invariable form or variable point of view onto a form. There is a point of view which belongs so much to the thing that the thing is constantly being transformed in a becoming identical to point of view. Metamorphosis of the true. What the artist is creator of truth, because truth is not to be achieved, formed, or reproduced. It has to be created. There is no other truth than the creation of the new. Creativity, emergence, what Melville called shape, in contrast to form. Art is the continual production of shapes, reliefs, and projections. The truthful man and the forger form part of the same chain. But in the end it is not they who are projected, elevated, or excavated. It is the artist, creator of the true, in the very place where the false attains its final power. Goodness, generosity. Nietzsche drew up a list of the characters of the will to power. The truthful man, then all the forgers who presuppose him, and all that he presupposes, the long exhausted cohort of superior men, but still behind the new man, Zarathustra, the artist, or outpouring life. There is only a slim chance, so great is the capacity of nihilism, to overcome it, for exhausted life to get control of the new from its birth, and for completed forms to ossify metamorphosis, and to reconstitute models and copies. The power of the false is delicate, allowing itself to be recaptured by frogs and scorpions. But it is the only chance for art or life. There would be still a third instance, beyond description and narration, this story, récit. If we attempt a provisional definition, as we have done for the other instances, still without taking into account the special importance of the talkie factor, we believe that this story in general concerns the subject-object relationship and the development of this relationship, whilst narration concerns the development of the sensory-motor schema. The model of truth thus finds its full expression not in the sensory-motor connection, but in the adequation of the subject and the object. We must, however, specify what the subject and the object are in the conditions of the cinema. According to convention, what the camera sees is called objective, and what the character sees is called subjective. Such a convention has place only in the cinema, not in the theater. Now it is essential that the camera sees the character himself. It is one and the same character who sometimes sees and sometimes is seen. But it is also the same camera which gives us the character seen and what the character sees. We may then consider the story as the development of two kinds of images, objective and subjective, their complex relation which can go as far as antagonism, but which ought to find resolution in an identity of the type ego equals ego, identity of the character seen and who sees, but equally well identity of the camera filmmaker who sees the character and is what the character sees. This identity passes through many trials which specifically represent the false, but ends up affirming itself for itself by constituting the true, even if the character has to die because of it. We might say that the film begins with the distinction between the two kinds of images and ends with their identification, their identity recognized. The variations are infinite because both the distinction and the synthetic identity can be established in all kinds of ways. The basic conditions of cinema are nonetheless here from the point of view of the veracity of every possible story. In the cinema of poetry, the distinction between what the character saw subjectively and what the camera saw objectively vanished, not in favor of one or the other, but because the camera assumed a subjective presence, acquired an internal vision which entered into a relation of simulation, mimesis, with the character's way of seeing. In short, there was the documentary or ethnographic pole and the investigation or reportage pole. These two poles inspired masterpieces, and in any case intermingled. But in challenging fiction, if this cinema discovered new paths, it also preserved and sublimated an ideal of truth which was dependent on cinematographic fiction itself. There was what the camera sees, what the character sees, the possible antagonism and necessary resolution of the two, and the character himself retained or acquired a kind of identity, insofar as he was seen or saw, and the camera filmmaker also had his identity as ethnologist or reporter. It was very important to challenge the established fictions in favor of a reality that cinema could capture or discover. But fiction was being abandoned in favor of the real, whilst retaining a model of truth which presupposed fiction, and was a consequence of it. But Nietzsche had shown that the ideal of the true is the most profound fiction. At the heart of the real had not yet been discovered by cinema. The veracity of the story continued to be grounded in fiction. When the ideal or model of the true was applied to the real, it began to change many things, since the camera was being directed to a pre-existing real, but in another sense. Nothing had changed, and the conditions of the story, the objective and the subjective, were displaced, not transformed. Identities were defined in a different way, but remained defined. This story remained truthful, really truthful, instead of fictionally truthful. But the veracity of the story had not stopped being a fiction. The break is not between fiction and reality, but in the new mode of the story which affects both of them. Fiction is inseparable from reverence, which presents it as true in religion, in society, in cinema, in the systems of images. Never has Nietzsche's dictum, "Suppress your reverences," been so well understood. What is opposed to fiction is not the real. It is not the truth, which is always that of the masters or colonizers. It is the storytelling function of the poor, insofar as it gives the false the power which makes it into a memory, a legend, a monster. What cinema must grasp is not the identity of a character, whether real or fictional, through his objective or subjective aspects. It is the becoming of the real character when he himself starts to make fiction, when he enters into the flagrant offense of making up legends and so contributes to the invention of his people. The character is inseparable from a before and an after, but he reunites these in the passage from one state to another. He himself becomes another when he begins to tell stories without ever being fictional. And the filmmaker, for his part, becomes another when there are interposed in this way real characters who wholly replace his own fictions by their own storytelling. Thus the cinema can call every model of the true so as to become creator and producer of truth. This will not be a cinema of truth, but the truth of cinema. Godard, who has often acknowledged his debt to Rauch, increasingly emphasizes this point. The image has to include the before and the after. It thus has to bring together in this way the conditions of a new, direct time image, instead of being in the present, as in bad films. It is under these conditions of the time image that the same transformation involves the cinema of fiction and the cinema of reality, and blurs their differences. In the same movement, descriptions become purely optical in sound, narrations falsifying, and stories simulations. The whole cinema becomes a free, indirect discourse operating in reality. The forger and his power, the filmmaker and his character, or the reverse, since they only exist through this community, which allows them to say, "We creators of truth." This is a third time image distinct from those we saw in the previous chapter. The two earlier ones essentially concerned the order of time, that is, the coexistence of relations or the simultaneity of the elements internal to time. The third concerns the series of time which brings together the before and the after in a becoming, instead of separating them. Its paradox is to introduce an enduring interval in the moment itself. These three-time images all break with indirect representation, but also shatter the empirical continuation of time, the chronological succession, the separation of the before and the after. They are thus connected with each other and interpenetrate, but allow the distinction of their signs to subsist in a particular work.